Hello and welcome to Unramblings, a podcast about stories and storytelling. I'm Mark, I have a background in English literature and storytelling.
And I'm Charlyn, and I have a background in social work and psychology.
This week we're going to be talking about Dr. Seuss's How the Grinch Stole Christmas, the 1966 film adaptation with Boris Karloff. We don't talk specifically about the book because we didn't read it, or about the two later adaptations with Jim Carrey and Benedict Cumberbatch, because we didn't watch them and didn't want to. It's possible that this week's one will be a shorter episode. It will probably still be longer than the source material, which is only half an hour. But, yeah. Oh, and happy holidays. I don't know, we're doing happy holidays?
We can.
Happy holidays. This will obviously have complete spoilers for How the Grinch Stole Christmas. If we have anything else to add in, we'll drop those in here. Hello, it's Mark from the future. We have a couple of small spoiler warnings this week. We discuss Nightmare Before Christmas and A Christmas Carol in referencing back to our previous episodes. We also wanted to give you a heads up that we do discuss Santa Claus in this episode, and small children might not appreciate the conversation. And back to Charlyn and Mark of the past. Welcome back! This will be our last episode of 2019, which is scary to say it like that. Stay tuned at the end of the episode and we'll tell you our entire January schedule. And you can also find that on social media as well. Shall we get into the summary?
Sure. How the Grinch Stole Christmas is a pretty simple story, much like A Christmas Carol that we covered last week. It is about a guy who is somewhat isolated from a nearby town, and he lives on a mountain about a little north of Whoville. So in this case, he's physically kind of isolated from the town rather than just doing that to himself socially. And he really hates Christmas, really doesn't want the people to engage in all of the really loud Christmas traditions, and so he decides to go and take all of their Christmas decorations and all the trappings of Christmas and haul it away in an effort to sort of thwart the holiday from happening. But when he does this, the people still come together and sing and, enjoy being together for the holiday, and he realizes that the trappings of the event are not actually the same as the event itself, and has a moment of growth and clarity where he goes and decides to return all of their holiday stuff and actually join in the celebration himself. And that's pretty much the entire story.
Yep. To prepare for this week's episode, we watched the film again,
which we do every year, but we'll probably also watch it again for enjoyment rather than for note-taking.
I hadn't seen the film until a few years ago. It was always your Christmas tradition. But
yeah.
I missed out on it entirely. I think it might be an American thing.
I was going to say, is it not so much of a thing in Britain?
It's always interesting to tell what's not a British thing and what's not a my strange particular family thing.
Yeah, that's true. Those aren't necessarily the same things. But I would watch it with my baby brother almost every year. He is 9 years younger than I am. So when he was little, we would watch it together on Christmas. I think probably starting when he was around 3. And so it kind of became a tradition for me to watch it.
Yeah. We have also taken to listen to the soundtrack when we're decorating.
Yes.
For Christmas / late Yule.
Yes. When we are putting all the ornaments and everything on our Christmas tree, we have the green vinyl soundtrack playing because we're extra.
Because we're that kind of douchebag.
Yes. What did I say?
Yeah. And then I read up some history of it briefly.
Yes.
10 minutes ago.
Mm-hmm.
Well prepared. Cool. Obviously, we've had a great Christmas morning, and this is going out live. This wasn't in any way recorded a week before Christmas. Before we get into it, we do want to take a moment to acknowledge that Dr. Seuss does have a certain amount of controversy and poor choices behind him in various pieces of his work. Some of his pieces depict minorities in some very stereotypical and offensive ways.
In fact, every single one that depicts minorities depicts them in stereotypical and offensive ways.
Yes. And he also did some other works like a minstrel show that he performed in blackface. None of this is okay, and we don't mean to condone any of it by discussing this work today. We're talking about it as part of, from a cultural perspective, and as part of the culture that lots of people grow up in, and it's still very prevalent today. But we didn't want to go ahead without acknowledging that that is a problem.
And also noting that he is dead. So nothing resulting from his work is giving him, in particular, any money, so, yeah.
But it's okay, because he's dead.
Well, no, but like we're not, so we're not financially supporting somebody who is racist because he has since died.
It's a particular problem because a lot of his works are still read in schools, and there's an aspect as to like who you see looking back at the page from you. For various children, that's not going to be the right thing to have back.
Right, especially with the age groups that his work's targeted toward. It sends an early message to minority children that they're less valuable in society.
Yeah. So there's a whole lot of stuff tied up in that. And I think that we've got a couple of things coming up in the next few months where we're going to talk some more about why we still choose to do these ones, but we're not going to get too bogged into it in the middle of Christmas. We will link to an article in the show notes that does discuss the pros and cons of still talking about his works in schools, but largely representation matters, and people should get to see themselves represented accurately.
Accurately and positively.
Yes. Okay. How the Grinch Stole Christmas. What do you want to talk about?
Well, I think, again, because it's such a simple story, some of the things that I want to talk about are more about the way that the story is told and kind of the narration and the perspective that it's being presented through. Because, again, like, there's not a whole lot to pick apart in terms of the actual narrative, although I'm sure we will, talk about that in the course of talking about other structural things.
Yeah, it's interesting with both this one and A Christmas Carol. They're both these sort of fables or moral stories.
Mm-hmm.
So they are just sort of fairly simply saying, this is a thing.
Yeah, and much like in A Christmas Carol, the message overall seems to be that Christmas is about coming together and connecting with people and community, rather than, in the case of How the Grinch Stole Christmas specifically, about the specific material trappings of Christmas or presents or anything like that. Like, there's explicit lines like, Christmas doesn't come from a store, Christmas Day is in our grasp as long as we have hands to clasp. Those are very explicit and are also very much the same message as A Christmas Carol.
Yeah. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that, like Christmas Carol, both of these have got Christmas in and are about Christmas, but seem to be largely secular.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
It's Christmas in both ones as a feast day.
As a community event.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like there's sort of generic conversations of being blessed.
But you know what I noted about that? It's just blessed Christmas tree.
Is that, I think it comes up at one other time. Maybe,
but like it's descriptions of the things they're doing, or like the traditions are blessed or blessed, rather than calling attention to any particular spiritual significance or God or Jesus or anything like that.
I mean, I think that most religions have a concept of being blessed. I don't think it's tied to Christianity.
Well, no, not specifically, but Christmas is like supposedly about the birth of Jesus.
But in the same way that we celebrate Christmas as it's the middle of the winter, and days are going to get longer sort of thing. Like, there are lots of people who celebrate Christmas despite the fact that they're atheists or whatever.
Definitely. Mm-hmm.
Because at the end of the day, a warm fire, a pretty tree with sparkly lights, and a really nice meal is a hard thing not to want to celebrate.
An excuse to give each other presents and be thoughtful. Yeah, I definitely know a lot of people who aren't Christian, like us, who celebrate Christmas. Growing up, like when I was in high school and middle school, one of my closest friends, his mom was Jewish and his dad was atheist, but had been raised in a household that observed Christmas and was Christian. And so they observed Christmas because it's basically just because it's fun, because it's nice, and because it's something that his dad enjoyed, even though his dad was atheist and it ascribed no religious significance to it in any way.
There's a reason that Christmas happens in the middle of December, and it's because you need something to look forward to in the middle of December because it's cold and miserable out.
Yeah, it's a pick-me-up, like a cultural pick-me-up.
But in addition to like there not being any specific religious things noted, like there's also a lot of focus on the tree, and like the log for the fire is a big thing in it, which I know evoked for me at least Yule log type things.
Yeah, and definitely also light, like the return of light. I know I talked to you about this at the end of the episode, at the end of watching the movie, but when the Who's come together and are singing in the morning of Christmas, they're holding hands in a big ring, and as they're singing, a bright light like just is generated in the center of their circle and like slowly rises up until through like animation it becomes the sun. And so it's very much like this illuminist thing where they're sort of chanting or singing the sun back in a very magical, like, rite type of way that I thought was really cool, and I'm surprised I never really focused on watching it all of these years.
Well, I think that Dr. Seuss always intended the Who's to be seen as sun worshippers.
Yep. 100%.
Yep. Really, it's just a coven of witches.
Yep.
Let's go with that.
Yep.
So, that's the official Unramblings take. Moving on.
But yeah, like, even, like, aside from just being devoid of particular Christian references, it does have this sort of, like, great magic rite depiction.
Yeah.
It's kind of cool.
Let's see, what else do we want to talk about?
The lack of religious stuff, and also the Grinch's being so unhappy about it, about the Christmas traditions. I know, it kind of reminded me in some ways of the way that some people who do not agree with celebrating Christmas can be kind of bitter about its prevalence in our society.
Yeah.
So I've known several different people who are Jehovah's Witness over my life, and some of them, like, just didn't care what other people were doing. But other people were very offended that, like, they couldn't escape the pervasiveness of holiday things, of like when it was someone's birthday, it sort of took over everything, and, like, you know, it was kind of hard to get away from it, and particularly with, like, Christmas or, like, gatherings around the holidays, of not being able to escape those things and feeling excluded by the presence of that stuff, you know, feeling kind of slighted by that. And so I wonder if that's something that you see there at all, of, like, taking it personally that other people are doing something in a way that you don't necessarily agree with.
I mean, I'll say that I certainly, within our world, I see that being a problem. And, like, the whole national holiday, it's a national holiday, but Christianity isn't the national religion.
Right.
Or at least it's not supposed to be. And, yeah, and I mean, like, all your favourite podcasts end up doing, like, 2 Christmas episodes, and that's pretty annoying. But within the actual film, yeah, I mean, he certainly seems to resent it, I think. I mean, it's difficult because you get only so much to work with, and we're primarily told that he's annoyed because it's noisy and loud and it disturbs him. He lives alone on a mountain with his pet dog, which we don't get told that he's unhappy the rest of the year to be alone. Like, it might just be his choice. But
he might just be sort of a hermit.
Right. But at the end of the film, he seems happy to be being included. So
maybe it's that he prefers to be totally isolated and the noise carries.
Yeah.
And so then he feels intruded on? I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, to come at it from a different direction, talk about a different side of it, I think that it's more that the noise, like, all the noise is generated by all of these gifts and toys that they've got.
Musical instruments and things.
So the noise becomes fairly directly metonym?
Where, like, the one piece becomes symbolic of the whole?
Yeah.
Whichever one that is.
But let me just double check this.
Okay.
I think it's a metonym. Yeah, it's a metonym. So the noise becomes a sort of metonym for the issue of the commercialization of Christmas and the fact that everything is about, or the Grinch is perceiving Christmas as being all about
stuff,
buying things and capitalism, which I think there's a decent amount we can say about. I think it's interesting because he's criticizing the commercialization of Christmas, but it's what he is perceiving it's going to be the next day. With that whole scene that you get where all the noise is being made and he's going through all those things, it's not saying this is happening and I'm listening to it now. He's saying this is going to happen tomorrow. So he's going off of knowledge of admittedly 53 years, but it's still his perception of what Christmas is about as an outsider on a mountain.
Right.
And what he assumes that they're all thinking and doing around the time. So it's sort of that there's this wall of between his understanding.
Yeah.
You want to add something?
Well, yeah, I think that definitely makes sense because he's at the top of this mountain, so I guess the only thing he's so high up, I can't remember how many thousands of feet up he is. It does say at some point, but he's not going to be able to see the details of the decorations, really. He's not going to be able to see the people doing things together and all of that. Although he knows that they do those things. He talks about, you know, carving the roast beast and how he hates that particular meal for some reason, and, like, talking about all the decorations and things, but he can't really see the details probably that well from up on a mountain, maybe like tiny, tiny figures. But he can hear the sound because it's carrying up, and maybe because of the weird acoustics, maybe it gets amplified or directed really close to him or something. So he's really just kind of perceiving it as only the parts that he's able to experience. And out of context, they're annoying. It's like when you have a really obnoxious neighbor who plays something really loud and you can kind of hear it through your floor or through your ceiling, but not enough that you can actually enjoy it and join in that experience. It's just something that's intruding on what you're trying to do in your own space.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is the town of Whoville are terrible neighbors.
But only once a year.
But only once a year.
Really, they just need to, like, put up a little note in the foyer of the apartment building or something. We're having a party this one day.
And you're invited. Like, I think that's an important part of it, too. I wonder about whether or not the Grinch has ever been invited to join in the holiday celebrations, because it does sound like he says it, like the narration says that he's been observing this for 53 years, and so this seems to be a case of him just being mad about it for 53 years and then finally like snapping and just taking all their shit.
Yeah.
But did they ever, like, do they even know he's there?
Yeah, and that's somewhat unclear. But I mean, with the way that he's portrayed as, like, assuming he knows what it's about, and it's about all this noise and horribleness, I can imagine that if they did invite him, his response would be, no, go away, get off my lawn.
After 53 years of it irritating him, sure, but if they do know he's there, when he first got to the area, he might not have built up the resentment. I kind of think that they don't know he's there. Partially because he is the only person in that area who seems to be green. Otherwise, he looks pretty similar to the Who's. Not totally the same, but very similar. And Cindy Lou Who doesn't know who he is, thinks he's Santa Claus because he's wearing a Santa Claus costume. I feel like if there was a guy like in the neighboring area who was bright green and like was the only bright green person around, people would know who the bright green person was. Yeah. So she is 2, but she seems more developmentally along than most 2-year-olds who are like humans. So.
Who's actually only lived for 5 years.
Well, yeah, like
tragic.
Like in terms of like, I don't know, I think she's probably similar to like a 4 or 5-year-old child, and maybe the 5-year-old kids don't know who the Grinch is, but I don't know. It seems weird.
Yeah, I mean, it does imply that maybe it would be very easy within the story for them to have set him up as a bogeyman. And be like, you don't want to go into the hills or the Grinch will get you. At which point you would see the Grinch and go, oh no, it's the Grinch. But you're right, they do seem to just not know about him.
But she's not scared of him. Yeah. So they clearly haven't done that. Like, it's not like she's afraid of green people because she totally believes that he's Santa Claus. Yeah. So.
And to look at it from like a sort of storytelling aspect and things, do you want to talk a bit about the sort of othering that is done for the Grinch?
Yeah, definitely. Like, I do kind of...
Is othering a generic enough term? Do people know what
othering well, like, it might be a story of vilifying the other, of, like, this person who doesn't observe our same traditions and doesn't live where we live, comes and takes all of our stuff and is just nefarious and also is mean to his dog. And it's just, like, completely vilifying this person who is also the only person who looks different from the people in Whoville. So that's definitely a dimension that I don't want to overlook.
Yeah. I think that the narration's interesting you already have this character who lives on the outside of town, and if he is known about, then he's mysterious and off in the mountains. It's not clear whether he's of the same species as the Who's, but even just like how the narrator talks about how he views things, like he talks about the Grinch hating, like, the toys and the roast beast and stuff. And I'm sure that there's some parents at home watching and going, yeah, I mean, those toys are pretty damn annoying. But at the same time, like, I think for a decent number of people, it does portray the Grinch as being cynical and miserly. Well, not miserly.
He's not miserly. He's not hoarding any. He lives in a cave.
No, he's cynical and he's crotchety, and the audience is told not to like him. From the narration and that point of view. There's also like the song that comes in and is like says what a terrible person he is, which there's a couple of moments in the film where it seems very much as though the Grinch can hear what the narration and the singing are saying, and I think there's probably there's a couple of points where he sort of looks to the camera and like nods and things in relation to the narration. Which if there's if there's this guy singing a song about how terrible you are on a regular basis, then I can see why you might not be in the best spirits.
Yeah, I suppose so. I don't think I noticed that. I don't think I picked up on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're definitely painting him as just generically, like, a hater. Like, he just hates anything that makes other people happy. But that kind of brings me to, like, really one of the questions I have about this is, like, who wrote this story? Like, who are we seeing the perspective of?
Yeah.
Would this be a very different story if more of the Grinch's perspective were featured? Not like the whole, Wicked, like Alpha, another situation where the green person is vilified. Is there a side of this that we don't see, like, of him being deliberately excluded, perhaps, from events in the town or something like that? Or him having his own traditions that they shit on. Like, it's, who knows? We only hear this narration who explicitly hand waves away an explanation by saying no one quite knows the reason and gives some, like, really silly possible explanations for him hating Christmas. Like, maybe his shoes were too small, or too tight, maybe his head was messed up, but really, probably he just got a too small heart.
The same sort of things that you get, like, in The Christmas Carol, where, like, Scrooge is viewed as this terrible person, and the story spends its time going, well, maybe that, like, this is his backstory, and maybe this is why he is like this. Whereas I think people in the street are probably much more sort of, oh yeah, I hear his shoes are too tight.
Yeah.
So that is a sort of very dismissive of someone else's life and concerns way of going about it. Unramblings, where we shit on people's childhood stories.
I mean, I love this story.
Yes.
It's a great story. The music is amazing and hilarious, especially the "You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch" has just some ingenious insults woven through it. Like, who comes up with this stuff? It's amazing. And that's the fun of it, is how unapologetically mocking it is, I guess. But at the end of the day, it is very childish. That's, I think, why it's something that appeals to children. It's not supposed to be picked apart, but we're going to do it anyway.
Yeah. I think a lot of what you see of the Grinch is interesting because while there's all this stuff to make him sort of othering and showing him as being kind of hateful, like, there's also a certain amount of stuff done to make him quite endearing and also to humanize him at the same time. It's like giving with one hand, taking away with the other. Like, he's fairly, like, clumsy and unlucky in that sort of, like, goofball villain sort of way at times.
Yeah, like the, like Wile E. Coyote.
Yeah. Like, everyone knows Wile E. Coyote is better than the Roadrunner. You're looking at me like that's not what everyone thinks.
No, Wile E. Coyote is the one that you engage with, yeah. Because he's the one who has expressions and, like, breaks the fourth wall and is trying so hard.
But then, he sort of has fun with his keeper.
Yeah.
Like, he's going around and, like, playing and making the clockwork toys march into the bag, and he's playing pool with the Christmas baubles. Like, those are sort of more fun, endearing ways. Like, he's doing a bad thing, but he's having fun doing it, so it's kind of true.
And not even just that he's having fun. Like, I had noted that you keep seeing him working smarter, not harder. Like, he's doing all these clever things that are both fun and cool and efficient. Yeah. And it's like, I could painstakingly take all of these things off, or I could line up the perfect shot and have them all roll out the hole in the wall right into my sack, and it will be so satisfying. It's like all of those trick shot YouTube videos or whatever, where, like, yeah, he probably wasted 5 times as much time trying to get that perfect, but it is pretty satisfying when you get it right.
I do want to say that I think for maybe next year we should get a Christmas tree that has all the decorations on but just goes up like a beach umbrella.
Oh yeah, that was pretty cool.
That would save me a whole lot of time. When he is confronted with Cindy Lou, his response is really weird.
Yeah.
His excuse is terrible. You don't need to take a whole tree to fix a single light. But I guess that she's 2 and stupid. Yeah, anyway. But, like, it's not clear whether his response to being caught by her is fear that he's being caught or guilt on some level.
I definitely read it as guilt, and I think it's part of that humanizing him and, like, foreshadowing his change of heart at the end.
And for him, humanizing the Who's.
Yeah.
Like, they're not this group of people that make lots of noise. They're this child standing in front of you. And, like, he doesn't just send her to bed, which I'm assuming someone put like that someone thinks is Santa Claus can be like, go back to bed, and
Mhm.
the kid goes back to bed. Like, he goes and gets her a drink as well.
Mhm.
He still steals all
And,
of her stuff.
and patted her head, like,
Yeah.
he's tender in putting her back to bed and everything.
Still steals everything from the house.
Yeah.
But, like, is kind to
Mhm.
her. So that's sort of a weird, interesting aspect to it.
Yeah, I hadn't even really thought about the aspect of that interaction being that it humanizes the Who's for the Grinch. But I think you're right. I think it definitely does play a role in him coming around later.
I think another thing that really shows that sort of like double-handed, he's a terrible person, but he's also more sympathetic in certain ways, is his relationship with his dog Max.
Definitely.
Because that is a put-upon, long-suffering dog right there, but a loyal one.
Mhm.
And the Grinch clearly, in some regards, does love that dog in ways that are humanizing. And then that's also kind of played for comic relief with like the whole reindeer thing and like getting stuck under the sleigh and everything.
Yeah. Max is definitely used as comic relief, but I also agree that he's part of how the story shows that there is good in the Grinch.
Yeah.
Because Max clearly loves him. He's treated badly during the course of the whole Christmas caper. Like, he whips him a couple of times, and tying the horn to his head is clearly painful and uncomfortable for him. And of course, trying to have him drag such a huge sleigh, and he's such a tiny dog, which again is for comic effect, but also if you actually think about it, like, that's an abusive thing to do. But Max, I think he keeps expecting the Grinch to treat him well and for things to be like a pleasant plan for the two of them to be doing together, like jumping up onto the sleigh like they're going for a ride, like, you know, and being happy to see him and stuff. And that kind of shows me that in general, the Grinch is kind to him and they do have a loving relationship, and like, I think supports this idea that the Grinch sort of snapped and is being really unreasonable and kind of uncharacteristic in this whole Christmas obsession, and is taking it out on his dog in some ways to serve his plan.
Yeah, which isn't cool.
It's not okay. Like, Max seems very surprised and confused by the things that the Grinch wants him to do for this plan that are uncomfortable or painful or whatever. And the fact that he's so confused by it tells me that he's not used to being manhandled and abused in this way.
Yeah. There is just like one really disturbing moment in the scene with the antlers and things that I want to touch on, which I don't know if disturbing is the right word. There's the line that reindeer are scarce, and then it pans across to where the Grinch has like a trophy-mounted set of antlers, and you're just like, oh, they're scarce, are they? I wonder why.
Huh. So I guess that indicates that maybe the Grinch eats reindeer a lot, or primarily.
Unclear. Or maybe I'm reading too much into it, but that is kind of our thing, so.
Yeah, I hadn't noticed that. Yeah, Max is adorable, though. He's the best comic relief in the story, and is just so sweet and loving and cute.
What else do you want to talk about?
I just want to say that no one is as productive as the Grinch. Like, okay, in one evening, he makes a Santa Claus costume, gets his dog tricked out to be a reindeer, takes everything from every house, not even just the stuff associated with Christmas, just everything, like the ice, individual poinsettia leaves, everything, in a single night, and then hauls all of that crap up a mountain in time for Christmas morning. Like, you have to think, even if he started pretty early in the day on Christmas Eve, that's a lot to do in 24 hours.
Yeah.
Especially, again, as ridiculously thorough as he is.
If you think about how long it takes you to take down Christmas decorations every year.
Yeah, like, it's just crazy. Especially, even aside from making a costume first.
Yeah.
Like, that in itself would take hours. Also, that's not how pattern making works at all. But point being, like, it's crazy. It's just like, wow. He should really just go into business as a moving company.
Yeah.
Like, he, one day move your whole house. He probably could do it in a few hours.
Move the whole town.
Yeah, it's crazy. So. Another thing I wanted to talk about briefly is something I didn't really notice until we were watching it for the podcast. But there's some interesting visual storytelling that happens in it, particularly toward the end. Like, the background colors and the Grinch's eye color change as his thoughts are being narrated to show like his thoughts and realizations about the nature of Christmas and the nature of the Who's. And I thought that was really interesting because I had noticed that his eyes turn to blue when he realizes, the meaning of Christmas, but I hadn't realized that like progression of backgrounds during that scene. Then his eyes go back to red until the point where he, gains the strength of 12 Grinches and goes and saves the day. But I thought that was interesting. It's subtle, but it really does make you feel like you're along for that ride.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if there were some other things that I noticed. I mean, there's the stuff we talked about with, like, the Who's and their weird sun summoning thing.
Yeah, which is kind of cool.
Which is an interesting bit of, like, symbolic storytelling with, like, the light coming from them, not from other things, that sort of thing.
Yeah, coming from them and being, like, showing the power of being together. Like, the literal power concentrated in the middle of the circle as a bright sun.
Are you suggesting Who's as a renewable source of energy and similar to nuclear fission?
Why not?
It is interesting that, like, they chose to make him green, because in the original book, it was only two-tone black and white, so he was portrayed as just white. There wasn't a colour in the original book. And the film came out in 1966, which means that the colour TV had just really started being a thing. So it wasn't until then that they had to decide on a colour. And they settled on green, and green is what Grinch has been ever since in every version. And it's an interesting choice from that point of view of the whole othering thing, because the only other group of people / species we see are the Who's that don't really have like traditional skin tone colours, but like I think there's some of them that are orange and stuff, but they're all sort of within that family. Whereas there are very few mammals in our world that are green. I want to say, do we have green mammals?
Well, sloths get sort of greenish because of algae or whatever.
Well, the sloth isn't green, the algae is.
It's true.
That's like saying that you're kind of purple because you're wearing a purple robe.
Not necessarily. It didn't grow on me.
You sure?
Yeah.
It wasn't that you weren't too certain about it at first, but now it's growing on you. And like you mentioned, as a nice side point, you mentioned earlier Wicked, and you got the Wicked Witch of the
West.
Yes, I knew that. Which similarly, like, oh, we have colour in our TV now. What colour is the bad guy?
Yeah.
They're green because they're weird and different and they're not us. It's a colour that codes fairly easily and quickly, not us, to an audience. And it's why aliens are little green men. I would argue. I realise I state that as a fact. Come at me, internet.
Oh, what have you done? Yeah, no, I do think that the timing with color TV probably does play a part in that, as both a way to make good use of that new capability and instantly signal that this person is different and not the same as the people we're supposed to sympathize with, which is the Who's. That kind of brings me to some of the musical storytelling, which is very, like, it's entirely biased in favor of the Who's, which of course the whole story kind of is. You know, you have this Christmas decorating song, which is very happy and, pleasant, and it has a good mood to it. And then you have, of course, You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch, which is very much just bashing the Grinch and in no way showing two sides to this conflict at all. It's just the Who's are these delightful, pleasant people who have these lovely community traditions, and the Grinch is awful.
Yeah, I mean, they set up an explanation for why he's upset and why he does what he does. They set up his motivation, like before the music really gets to anything. But with such a, isn't this terrible tone to it?
Yeah.
Like, isn't he being unreasonable? And then by the time you get to You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch, there's not, you're a mean one that's being pushed by being an outsider and...
For 53 years.
It's just, you're a terrible person and everything you're doing is terrible. So it's doesn't care much about the intentions. I'm not saying that the intentions make it okay, but as you say, it's very one-sided at that point, so it's interesting.
Another thing that's kind of interesting about the narration and the music is that they seem to sort of be on different timelines. Like, the music seems to always be in the present. Like, You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch doesn't have any capacity in there for the Grinch to be redeemed in any way. It's unilaterally condemning him and making all of these comparisons to things that are so inherently awful. Like, there's no way you're making a bad banana with a greasy black peel a nice thing. I guess if you like banana bread, maybe you can. But okay, that was a bad comparison. But there's no way you're making an arsenic and toadstool. No, what is it? There's no way you're making a sauerkraut and toadstool sandwich with arsenic sauce a pleasant, non-poisonous thing, you know?
Sure.
But the narrator, as opposed to the music, is telling the whole story kind of zoomed out, knowing about the end. And so he is setting it up as, this is what happens, but then the Grinch's small heart grew 3 sizes that day. You know, so he is retelling this story, but the music's inserted from the time it's happening. Yeah. Without knowledge of the end.
Which I guess is aided by the fact that you have a different narrator to the singer. Mm-hmm. It's not like it's one voice coming through.
Yeah. So I think the music kind of gives you, like, the perspective from when it's happening instead of the zoomed out full picture.
Yeah. That is an interesting aspect.
But it's still very much the music is still on the side of the Who's, like 100%.
Yeah.
Although the Who's don't seem to blame, like, they welcome him into their holiday celebration, like, immediately. Even though he literally just stole all of their Christmas stuff and their food, they welcome him with open arms into the celebration, which I think says more about the way that they interpret Christmas, you know, as a time of coming together and setting whatever aside and having hands to clasp, etc., and, like, that being what, you know, the holiday is about. Maybe at a different point in time, they wouldn't have been so welcoming. It's hard to say. So I don't think that the You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch is from the perspective of the Who's, unless maybe that's their perspective separate from the holiday spirit.
I would probably say not on that. I think it's probably the perspective of more the viewer or the narrator type side of things. It is interesting, like, looking at alongside Nightmare Before Christmas, which we did 3 weeks ago now? 4 weeks? I don't know.
A time.
Yes. With just that same message of, you've come to decide that Christmas is about gifts and decorations and trees. And it's not. It's about this other togetherness and being welcoming. And, like, in that, Santa's, you've messed this up, let me fix it, here, have some snow. That same sort of, like, welcome, come enjoy our roast beast. You can carve it because you're significantly bigger than us and good bit of leverage for doing that. No? Okay.
Sure. I think that I've said all I wanted to about the visual and musical storytelling. What about you?
Yeah, I think I'm good. Did you have a big question for this week?
I did. So, kind of from the beginning, and even when I was just thinking about doing this episode, I've kind of been wondering, is this a story of a conversion? Like, converting somebody to your traditions or your religion? Or a story of inclusion? Or is it a story of vilifying the other? Is it some of them, but not all? Like, because I kind of see elements of all of those in different parts of it.
I think a lot of it depends, like, you were talking about what point of view the songs are from.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it comes from what point of view you're supposed to see the film from and who you're supposed to sympathize with. Because if you're talking about it from the point of view of the Who's, then the story is that there's this man out in the mountains who is, like, grumpy and angry and comes and steals all your stuff, but you can still welcome them in. Whereas the story from the Grinch's side point of view, which I'm not sure whether we're supposed to see it from that side or not, because on the one hand, all the storytelling devices tell us that he's a bad person, but at the same time, he's the one the story follows. Whereas from the Who's accept him, but at the same time, he sort of accepts them. And it's about him having an understanding of who they are, and not vilifying them based on what he thinks.
Okay.
So rather than sitting in the mountains going, those people are doing these things and they're horrible and noisy, he comes down and goes, oh, that's not what this celebration is about. This celebration is about coming together, and that's something I can get behind.
Mm-hmm. And also not something I can take away.
Yeah.
You know, not something I can prevent or necessarily even want to prevent.
Yeah.
So even though it does kind of have some of these themes of this person doesn't participate in these rituals, then comes around and does participate in these rituals, which can feel sort of conversion-y, but it also has this part of, you know, that someone wrongs this community, but then realizes that was a shitty thing to do and tries to make it right and is welcomed and forgiven. It ultimately kind of comes down to this was all a huge misunderstanding in the first place. You did some shitty stuff with your misapprehension, even though it would also have been shitty even if Christmas was just about streamers and presents and noise making and stuff. It's still a shitty thing to go and steal everyone's stuff, but that it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding and maybe feeling of being excluded. Like, I don't know that the Grinch would have done that stuff if he felt like he would have been included if he'd wanted to be, because he does so readily become included and join into the festivities.
So there's a part of me that could see a reading of this where, yes, it is about how people who aren't part of this should be part of this.
Like a assimilation story?
Right. But I think that the thing that makes me err away from that is that the Who's don't have any agency in the film.
Mm.
We see very little of them in any way acting on something, like they're celebrating as a group. Mm-hmm. And Cindy Lou is seen as an individual, but otherwise there's not much. So it's not as though they're sending out missionaries to the Grinch's hilltop to be like Mount Crumpet, I believe.
Yes.
To be like, hey, have you thought about celebrating Christmas?
Yeah.
Regardless of whether that means Jesus' birth or whether it means we're gonna get a tree and some great food and some loud shit. Wanna come play?
And then we're all gonna sing in a circle and create a giant magic ball of light. It'd be really cool.
Is this a cult?
It might be a cult.
All the agency is with the Grinch. Like, everything he does is his choice. He sees something going on, he chooses to go and steal the stuff, and then he feels bad about it because he realizes that he's misunderstood it and his motivations were correct. And then he chooses to go and join. Like, there was nothing stopping him from going, oh, I've misunderstood this, here, have your stuff back, I'm going back to my hilltop. That's
true. I do like that you point out he felt bad about it. Like, you know, if he interpreted it before as just this really obnoxious thing where they're just all super loud and really inconsiderate of how it affects him up on Mount Crumpet, and it's sort of like getting revenge on your crappy neighbors. It's you go and put a potato in their tailpipe or something, and then you feel bad about it.
Please do not put potatoes in your neighbor's tailpipes. We are not legally liable.
No, that's a bad idea, and you shouldn't do it. But, you know what I mean? Like, you could see this as just him not even... Because he doesn't see it as the significant community event that it is. He just sees it as this obnoxious thing that's irritating, that he wants to thwart something. He wants to stop from happening.
Yeah. As far as, like, what happens within the film, I think that that's a fairly safe reading.
Just that it's a misunderstanding and he's kind of a jerk based on the misunderstanding
and he has the agency. What Dr. Seuss may or may not be trying to say about society could be more problematic.
Very much so, especially because we know that, you know, all of his, as we mentioned at the top of this episode, all of his depictions of minorities were really racist, and that could indicate some underlying, not necessarily intentional ideas of, like, pro-assimilation ideas.
Yeah. I mean, based off of a fairly brief reading, it sounds like a lot of his, like, racial minority problems were ignorance-based.
And stereotypes. Promoting of stereotypes.
Right. But I could see this being more problematic if the message is, if you're Jewish and you're tired of walking into every store and seeing Christmas decorations everywhere and nativity scenes on every corner, you should just suck it up. That's not a message that I would condone, and I think if you sit down and watch the film, you can't see that. But if you are looking at it within our culture, which I think you have to at some point, like, there's a possibility for that as a problematic reading. Or a problematic message.
Yeah.
Do you have anything more to say on that?
I don't think so. I think that you could definitely see conversion or assimilation themes and, like, marginalization themes, but I think what it is trying to be is a story of inclusion. Whether or not it 100% succeeds in that is a different thing.
Yeah.
But I think that's what it's going for, is for it to be an inclusive reading.
if like the Grinch had his own like little celebration thing for that time of the year, and that became a part of the Who's as well, and it was an inclusive thing of everyone's celebrations, that would be a more clear reading, if perhaps heavy-handed.
Yeah. He didn't seem to do anything for Christmas, so.
I mean, as far as we know, he doesn't do anything at all.
That's true. We don't really get a whole lot of, his day-to-day life or,
We know he has a dog, a sleigh, a curtain, and a lot of empty bags.
Yeah. And a lamp, I think. And a case full of reindeer heads. Horns. Something.
A little trophy thing of, like, a little trophy mount of reindeer horns.
Yep.
Not an entire case of heads. That would be a very... I said it was a lightly disturbing fact, not just straight up horror.
Okay.
Wow. So does that answer our big question?
I think so.
Okay. I think that there's a bigger question here. That is, where is Santa? Because the Grinch is very clearly drawn as a sort of anti-Santa.
Yeah.
We know Santa exists in this world because Cindy Lou thinks that he's Santa when he's dressed up in a Santa outfit. And if it was the parents are putting out presents and it's not Santa coming by, then
the parents would be around.
They would have discovered the Grinch stealing all the stuff quite a lot earlier, because the stockings don't already have things in them when he's stealing them. They have yet to be filled. So presumably we're waiting for Santa to come by and drop stuff off.
I don't know. Like, the idea of Santa, is definitely in this world because, as you say, Cindy Lou Who mistakes the Grinch for Santa. And so that was my first thought, too, is that it must be a world where there is not, like, a literal Santa. There is, the parents going and putting presents under the tree and filling the stockings, etc. I hope we don't have any really young listeners.
We'll put it in the spoiler warnings.
Yes. But if we have young listeners, they'd hear it in the spoiler warnings.
We can be obscure about it.
Okay. So, what was I going to say? Oh, yeah. So, that's a good point that maybe the parents would know. But also, I think the point is that the community doesn't get too wrapped up in the stuff and they see the spirit of Christmas as being its own thing. So, maybe maybe off camera, the parents are getting up and trying to sneakily do the Christmas thing and being like, oh, crap, what happened to all of our stuff? And then just being like, well, that's not really what Christmas is about, and getting some sleep, and then getting up in the morning for the big town sing.
I mean, the giant orb summoning.
Yes.
But, like, the risk of him being found while removing all this stuff. Also, like, they're very heavy sleepers, because he's, like, shoving trees up chimneys and all this stuff. Like, it's a lot of noise.
You know what? Maybe they actually are, like, hibernating, and that's why he has time to do this. Probably not. You said really heavy sleepers. And also, it must take a long time to do all that shit. Stop giving me that look.
Hot take, the story's actually 3 months long. It's just very well cut together.
The Grinch doesn't have a great idea of what constitutes a night.
Or maybe they're all out partying in the next town over or something, and they've just left Cindy Lou Who is the only Lou left alone in town.
Well, isn't she tucked into bed with, like, other kids?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I think she is.
So all the kids are the only ones left in town.
No.
But no, Santa is weirdly absent. And
yeah, that's true.
So I don't know how that was going to play out. Or maybe, like, they just trust that they'll wake up before their kids in the morning, which
maybe
seems like a rash assumption. My understanding of children is that they wake up at Christmas at about 3 a.m. regardless. I say not having children, but having been a child.
Yes. Maybe they're all super optimistic or set really early alarms to get up for Christmas morning.
They are optimistic and resilient people, so maybe.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Santa just seems to not be there at all.
Maybe the Who's were bad this year.
Oh, no.
Maybe there was a lot of sacrificing going into making that orb.
Oh, no.
Anyway.
So are we ready for fun facts?
I think so.
You have some, right? Because I don't.
Oh, okay. Didn't know I was carrying this part of the podcast.
Yeah, sorry.
So, several of mine are Dr. Seuss related himself. Okay, so, first off, Dr. Seuss apparently drove a car with a license plate that read Grinch, which I thought was fun. The character actually first appeared in a previous story called The Hubbub and the Grinch, which was from 1955, a couple of years before the original How the Grinch Stole Christmas book came out. And talking about, like, the similarity between Dr. Seuss, or Ted, and his characters. Seuss's stepdaughter said, "I always thought the cat was Ted on his good days and the Grinch was Ted on his bad days."
Interesting.
Which is particularly interesting because when talking about why he wrote the poem, he said, "I was brushing my teeth on the morning of the 26th of last December when I noticed a very Grinchish countenance in the mirror. It was Seuss. So I wrote about my sour friend, the Grinch, to see if I could rediscover something about Christmas that obviously I'd lost." So he sort of cast himself as the Grinch, which is evidenced in the fact that the Grinch has suffered for 53 years, and Dr. Seuss was 53 years old when he wrote it.
Oh, interesting.
And then the last thing I have is that there are actually 2 sequels to How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which are so popular that you've not heard of them. One of them is Halloween is Grinch Night, in which the Grinch comes down into Whoville to scare the Who's. Presumably in a fun way that doesn't entirely reverse everything we just talked about, but I'm just going to not worry about that. And also another one called either Grinch's The Cat in the Hat, or The Cat in the Hat Gets Grinched.
Does that mean that the Grinch goes and steals all the Cat in the Hat stuff? And then gives it back and then plays with him?
Presumably.
Okay.
Wait, I can find out. It's also known as The Grinch versus the Cat in the Hat.
All the names.
I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but it seems like it probably does a decent amount of work at undoing everything we've talked about, and maybe also has some weird stuff in it. Moving on!
Sorry, what?
Apparently the Cat in the Hat accidentally insults the Grinch by calling him Mr. Greenface, which out of context doesn't sound great.
No.
But also it was in the 80s and I don't think Dr. Seuss worked on it, so... Okay, so feedback, follow-up, and late thoughts from previous episodes.
Yes, we finally have some feedback and late thoughts stuff from...
We have feedback?
From, Andrew.
So we forgot to mention when we were doing the Christmas Carol episode that there is a song that was cut from the theatrical release and isn't included on Disney Plus called When Love Is Gone. You can find it online, and in some releases of the film it's still included. It's a song that explains Scrooge's state of being by giving a more in-depth look at the breakup between him and Belle. It's reprised at the end of the film and the meal at Cratchit's house with The Love We Found, which signals an end to the loneliness period that Scrooge has been in and has made him so miserly in the film version of the story.
Do we think that that musical number changes anything about our final analysis of whether Scrooge becomes a better person by the end, or, anything about his motivations before that?
I don't think it does for me, because he's shown to be he's shown to be miserly and dislike Christmas before that song and before that breakup. So I don't quite buy it in their narrative as being the reason that he is who he is.
Right, it's a symptom, not the cause.
Yeah, and also, a girl dumping you shouldn't make you a terrible person for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
You should be able to brush that off. I mean, I guess that it is the story of... Well, no, it's not the story of him brushing that off because he was bad before that, but... Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would hesitate to say you should just brush that off, but point being, she breaks up with him because he's gotten obsessed with wealth and keeps putting off their marriage because he is never satisfied with the amount of money he has and the position he has in his company. And so, it's a fundamental issue of priorities that are still the problem he has at the beginning of the story. So I agree with you that this was sort of a breaking point of him on that path, but he was already on that path.
Yeah. You can say the love we found is an end to his miserliness, and you can say, well, why was he miserly? Well, because he was lonely. And why was he lonely? Because Belle broke up with him. Well, why did Belle break up with him? Because he was miserly.
Yeah. And it's not actually Belle's fault. It's not... He didn't become the person he was because she broke up with him. She broke up with him because of the person he was becoming.
Yeah. So... I think it's an interesting fact that the song was originally included and is cut from a lot of things. Mm-hmm. I think it is an interesting musical note for them to use the Love We Found as a reprisal at the end to close things off. I don't think it quite fixes the narrative enough for me to feel that Scrooge really becomes that much better throughout the film, or more so than we already said he did in the last episode.
Yeah. I do think it was probably a good opportunity to humanize him more and to show that he had feelings and that it was painful for him to go through that breakup and to be confronted with those problems in his perspective and his priorities, and that he responded to that by doubling down on the problems that she had with him, rather than taking that as a turning point to maybe try to fight to win her back, maybe try to reconnect with his, love of people and his community and, other values in life. But he didn't. She left. He didn't try to contradict her in any way in terms of her assessment of his character and his priorities, and just doubled down on it.
Yeah. Yes. And the other thing that scene does, is, having that scene in the film does, means that he doesn't, just spontaneously look like he's been crying for half an hour.
That's true. Yeah, that was a weird cut, because we did note when we were watching it that suddenly he was on this weird bridge that was, very small and angled, and apparently during that scene, they walk up to that bridge and, she sort of fades away and he's still standing there, and it makes sense when you have the whole scene.
Yeah, but he has been looking on and is clearly happy, and then it cuts back to him and it looks like he's been crying. And in the song, he does cry, but he doesn't if you cut the song out, so it's just kind of weird. Anyway, any other late thoughts or anything? Oh, and I should say thank you for Andrew Powell to pointing out that song existed again after we'd recorded the episode and forgotten to mention it. I'm sorry that we don't agree with your analysis of it. As promised, we're ready to announce our lineup for January. We're going to be doing some stuff that's a little bit different, as I know that we got bogged down a little bit in Christmas-themed things between Nightmare Before Christmas, Christmas Carol, and How the Grinch Stole Christmas. So on January 1st, we're going to be doing David Bowie's album The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. On January 8th, we're going to talk about the Veronica Mars TV series. On January 15th, we're going to talk about Raymond Chandler's novel The Big Sleep. On the 22nd, we're going to talk about Season 1 of Russian Doll. And on the 28th, we're going to talk about Neil Stephenson's novel Seven Eves.
So if you have not yet consumed those stories, try and do it.
And if you're thinking about consuming Seven Eves, start now. It's a big book. Very, very good book.
Yes. Excellent book. But also meaty.
Justifiably meaty. Okay. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Unramblings, on Twitter at UnramblingsPod. You can email us with feedback, questions, complaints, thoughts, words at unramblingspodcast@gmail.com. And you can continue the discussion on social media with the hashtag Unramblings, and we will do our best to respond to any comments made on it. Please rate, review, subscribe, and share with your friends.
Thank you for listening to Unramblings. We hope that you'll join in next week.
And happy holidays!
Yes, happy holidays.
He's cynical and, sort of...
Crotchety?
No, I said cynical, not
I
serious.
didn't get that.
He's cynical? Just the once parent. What's the word I'm looking for?
Crotchety?
Yeah. That's a weird, interesting thing.
A weird what? Can you say that again? Because it was the chime that also you didn't enunciate.
So that's sort of a weird, interesting aspect to it.